Thanks for the intro. So I hope you weren't turned off by the title of this talk, because what that really is a fancy way of saying it's still way too hard to make a map or use OpenStreetMap data. And I hope some of you agree. If you don't agree, then I'm going to try to convince you in this talk that it is too hard to make a map. Anyways, just to go a little bit more into the title. So what is Neogeography? This was sort of a catchy term about 20 years ago, around the time when Google Maps emerged as a popular platform. I guess it was mainly Andrew Turner, who's now at Esri, who popularized this term. He talked about Neogeography as a process where people can use and create their own maps on their own terms and publish them to the web, in contrast to GIS, which was done by professionals. So Neogeography can be anything from sharing your location, making mashups with Google Maps, publishing things on the web, just anything that was fundamentally very open and accessible to people to make maps. A more sort of academic description was by the company Placial, which was around about 15 years ago, and it defined Neogeography as anything from things like urban exploration and things like radical cartography, travel writing, photo blogging. Those were all things, activities that fell outside of, old style map making, or not old, but sort of being only the domain of a cartographer or a GIS professional. Those were all valid use cases for mapping that would be enabled by the internet. So did this idea of Neogeography succeed at all? It seems like there's mashups and applications and APIs all over the place. So a lot of people would say yes. It's not just people using ArcGIS anymore. Sure, if you are a professional working at the fire department or the city government, then maybe you use Esri. But I think being able to look at maps now is a lot more things like a web application that embeds a map that you can put markers on. It seems like this is very mainstream and is everywhere now, and it's been that way for a long time. This sort of ethos of Neogeography is also pretty well encapsulated by OpenStreetMap. I think most people would agree. OpenStreetMap is a collaborative project with thousands, hundreds of thousands of contributors, and it involves map editing, and that's what a lot of the conferences or all the talks here are about, which is data production, which is contributing your geographical knowledge to a shared commons. And there are a multitude of tools and systems and software, free software to accomplish that. So like ID, which we all love. And in my opinion, so mapping or this idea of like Neogeography should also encompass this consumption of that map data. So that is making some sort of map product, using tools like Maputnik or Leaflet or MapLibre to make some sort of map and show it to the world and put it online like in a web map. So there's map editing and there's map making. So in my opinion, so OSM is at its best when it encompasses both data creation and data consumption. So it's not just about map data creation, but also about using that map data to be creative for a business, for commercial use, for anything. All these activities that we use maps for in our daily lives. And a lot of people are attracted to OSM as an alternative to a platform like Google, which is completely one way. Maybe you can add some reviews to Google. But what's really radical is this idea of having a two-way relationship with this infrastructure in our lives. Since most people, they have a map app on their phone, but what would really be beautiful is if they could contribute to that thing that they use every single day. So OSM succeeds in this sense because it has sort of won the battle of mindshare over the past decade or almost 2 decades. Basically, any company that wants to use map data or any organization is going to start with OSM data. It's become the default choice over, like there was some competitors maybe 15 years ago, but now it is sort of the biggest open map data projects. Part of that is due to its licensing. Its licensing is commercial friendly, but it also has a copyleft clause, which ensures that it stays open and that data that's added to it or data that is derived from it stays open. And another big part is the tagging schema is very open-ended on purpose. So if you wanted to go map things like miniature trains, which people do, if it was a fixed set of layers in a fixed tabular schema, it would not be appropriate for more open-ended use cases, more fun use cases. But because the tagging scheme is totally open, it enables all those. So I said this talk would be highly opinionated, and when I say this, many people disagree. But I think it's still far too difficult to create any sort of product or map from OSM data, and I'll explain why. So first of all, pretty much every single consumer of data needs to be an expert on the tagging scheme because it's so open-ended. There's no sort of broadly accepted convention for what layers, for example, to create. And that's also by design. So for example, the OSMF does not tell people what to map. For the same reasons, there is no, pretty much every single company will need to derive their own tabular schema on top of OSM. And OSM also has a guiding principle, which is the on-the-ground rule, which is that the only data in principle is data that can be verified and is objective on the ground. And once you start talking about things that you need to make a visual map, for example, the presentation yesterday about multilingual maps, sometimes they need a shortened name or a common name of an area, but there is no objective evidence that that thing exists on the ground, so therefore it usually does not really belong in OSM. So the scope of the projects, both in terms of schema and in terms of this on-the-ground rule, are often not enough for making a map product. So for example, if you just want to make a map of a road network, then you need to have a lot of expertise in specific tag values and even how those vary in different countries. So there's not really any normalization. Sometimes there is mass editing projects to make a more normalized schema, but in general, it is very open-ended. And here's another part of where I think OSM making a map is too hard, which is to put a map online, you need to be an expert on some sort of specialized software. And that software is specific completely to OSM and is not general purpose. So for example, if you go to the Switch to OSM site, which is very helpful, has been around for, I think, more than a decade, you immediately need to deal with, for example, a plugin or a module for Apache to serve tiles. So it essentially means that in order to put a map online, you have to be a system administrator. So the scope of people that can make maps from OSM is going to be limited by people who know how to set up and deploy a Linux server. Now, for the audience here, that might be many of you, but I'd argue for the Neogeography audience, that is a very, very small percentage of people that both want to make a map and have this intersection of specialized skills, both in tagging knowledge and in software knowledge and in system administration knowledge. So, and in terms of maybe controversial opinions, why can't we have nice things in OSM? Why isn't it easy? And I'd argue a big part is because the business of OSM and commercial companies, they rely on OSM being hard to use. If making a map from OSM was so easy, then there wouldn't really be any business in having a commercial product that is derived from OSM, like a data package download or a tile API. Those are all businesses that rely on OSM being hard to use. So maybe you might disagree, but in general, I think this explains why this ecosystem for making a data product from OSM easy just does not really exist. Some people call OSM the Wikipedia of maps, and maybe this is like a bit of a straw man, but here's why I disagree. For Wikipedia, it is a website, and if you want to download all the data, there is an XML dump of all of Wikipedia on the left, just like there is a Planet OSM dump on the right. I think most people have seen the right one, but maybe haven't seen the left one. And that's because the main way to edit or use Wikipedia is through the OSM, it's the main way to access Wikipedia is through the Wikipedia web app. So everyone uses the website. If you want to look at a web page, then you can just go to that Wikipedia page. There's no real need to download the entire dump. But for OSM, in general, most of the consumption of OSM is through some third party, whether that's a commercial service or even something like Apple. So when you go to Apple Maps, you're using OSM, but you don't realize it. And that's because Apple has done all the effort of processing OSM into some sort of product that is closed. Sure, there's things like OSM Carto, but the kinds of things you can do on OSM Carto are not really as full-featured as a consumer map app like Apple Maps. So this idea of chasing this dream, so I really think the dream is that anyone should be able to make a map of the world. And that is kind of a pretty ambitious vision that I don't think is true right now. Maybe you could argue this is already true, but I don't think that this anyone is really a wide audience. I'd say that right now, that anyone includes people that have a specific set of tagging knowledge and software knowledge and system admin knowledge, while really this could be anyone that is fairly technically skilled. Maybe people that can make a website should be able to make a map. So I'm going to present a couple of projects I think are making this dream a reality. There's three of them. The first one is Overture Maps, which a lot of people have heard about. So why do I think Overture Maps is going to make this a reality? So first of all, it does enforce or design a common schema to make OSM easier to use. It does not encompass all use cases, but for many use cases, a layer-based schema is going to be much more accessible for making downstream products than the raw, than just OSM tags. So second of all, for Overture, there is a liberal approach to imports, while in OSM, there's always been a tension between manual editing versus what people call like robo-editing or even AI editing. But by increasing the scope of data to beyond just things that are verifiable on the ground, the map can become much more complete, and that will open it up to a lot more use cases. And I think in the future, we could even have some concept of trying to reduce the imports into OSM in favor of more of these aggregator projects like Overture. And some people kind of perceive Overture as competing with OSM, but in fact, Overture is downstream of OSM. It does not aim to be a mapper contributions project. It is a data project and a software project. So another project that I think is making OSM more accessible and easier to use is OSMF vector tiles, which Paul talked about today. And I think this is also going to be a leap forward because it is going to be a tile layer accessible to a wide audience instead of just customers of a commercial API that is accessible to anyone with some customization. For example, you can change the language that's displayed from just name to name EN or name DE for different languages. And that is a huge leap over just being able to see a single name tag on OSM Carto. So the one limitation that I say about why OSMF vector tiles is not the complete solution is because OSMF vector tiles are not intended to be run outside of that one particular instance. Because it is designed for min-only updates, if you are a company or an individual that wants to run a vector tile map, it is not going to be practical for you to run this entire stack because it is much more complicated. Finally, moving on to the last thing, new data formats for serving maps or other data products. So the one I work on is called PM Tiles, which some of you might have used. There's also other formats like Flat GeoBuff and GeoParquet. What makes these in common is that they're sort of cloud native. They can be used without specialized software or a web server or a tile server. And I think this is one of the most important things to adopt for making map publishing more accessible. So cloud-native formats like PM Tiles, GeoParquet, and Flat GeoBuff makes publishing maps accessible to web developers without specialized software or system expertise. And more importantly, these three formats are not specific to OSM. So those formats can be adopted in contexts and with datasets that are not just OpenStreetMap. That means they can become more mature. That means that people can use, for example, a more general language like SQL to query a GeoParquet file. And that will also make using OSM data much more accessible to a wider audience. So last slide, in conclusion, those are the reasons why I think it is still too hard, much too hard. It's still too hard to make a map from OSM data. And this idea of Neogeography is essential for making OSM relevant to the widest possible audience. So once you can make a map and publish it using simple tools, then people who are not just experts on tagging or experts on system administration can both make a map and also contribute to the map. And finally, these innovations for making OSM easier to use probably need to come from somewhere outside of the traditional SaaS market for OSM products. Because like I said, a lot of the incentives in place for making OSM easier to use don't exist right now. But if there's ways to collaborate outside of just that one industry of making APIs, then I'm pretty hopeful that those formats and other new softwares such as TileMaker, PlanetTiler, can make OSM easier to use. Anyways, that's my take, the end of my talk, and I have time for plenty of questions. Thanks. Should I pass around the mic for questions? Or I think it's small enough that people can just... People want to speak loudly. Yeah, if anyone wants to... If people have questions. Yep.
I have a question. Okay, so do you think it would help to make it easier for people to make maps if OSM kind of moved closer to the general GIS world in terms of like data model and data formats used? Because right now OSM kind of seems to believe that it's special data model with a lot of tooling that is custom and specifically designed to OpenStreetMap. I think it would be better if it kind of moved to the stuff that it's generally used by other like people who make maps. So stuff like using regular points, lines, areas instead of having some custom stuff that is then still converted to those things to serve to people, and using formats like GeoParquet or anything more compatible with other available tooling than protobufs and XMLs?
So I think that's already happening. So Overture is a good example in that, so even though the data is stored as GeoParquet, because it's a tabular format, you can easily convert that to like a shapefile or GeoJSON, for example. And those are simple features. Those are like points, lines, and polygons. I mean, that's just one example, though. I don't think that because there's other projects that are there. So for example, like the Osmium command line tool can convert OSM to like a GeoJSON. But I think one challenge has also been that a lot of those formats don't scale to if you're using like the Planet, like GeoJSON. So that's one good example of where I think GeoParquet is pretty useful. I've seen other projects. There's one called Quack OSM, which uses DuckDB to do some processing of OSM, and I think that's also like another good example of making OSM into like a more GIS format. So I think within the past maybe 2 years, there's been a lot of innovation. There's been a lot of innovation for doing that. Yeah. Bart?
Yeah, I have a question. So about this last point, so you say there's a conflict of interest basically with people providing software as a service because they don't want to make it easier. But how do you solve that? Because developing these tools is expensive. Like any software development is expensive. So how do you get funding if you don't have a software as a service model?
Yeah, it's something I've thought a lot about because software as a service is still like the best business model in terms of like it's like that's why all of our like apps on our phones are now subscriptions, is because like if you can turn what used to be like a one-time purchase into some sort of API, then that's better for capturing like some sort of business. I think that in general, because for example, map APIs have been around for so long that I think it's quite saturated, that there's already many sort of providers of, let's say, OSM data as tiles, that there's very little differentiation between those different providers. And I think that's one of the factors that means that people will explore new tech in this space instead of just making a proprietary API. But the question of like, how do you fund that is still a good one. I think a lot of cases is like, so for example, like the Linux kernel, sort of, it has multiple competing companies like Samsung and Red Hat are some of the biggest companies that might have competitive products, but they collaborate on Linux. So not to bring up like Overture again, but it's sort of a similar situation where it's like, you have to carve out some sort of space for collaboration in the commercial space, even though those companies might have competing projects. Question here?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation in the first place. And you mentioned OSMF vector tiles as one of their projects or tools which might make things better and easier. And you mentioned that just because it's already in place and the like infrastructure is there, or vector here means something. I mean, is it because it's vector approach, or it's more about just because it's already in place and infrastructure is ready?
I think it's both of those. It's because the OSMF, from my understanding, and other people might be able to correct me on this, but they have, I think, donations of infrastructure like servers and bandwidth, so they can serve a public good, like a public tile API without an API key. So that's one part. Vector is another part because you can customize or change the colors or language pretty easily. And the third part is that, as far as I know, in order to use those vector tiles, you'll need to use something like MapLibre. So it sort of has been made possible by the open source MapLibre project because in order to use the vector tiles, you'll also need to change the front-end rendering. But because there's a pretty good and so there's an already good mature project in MapLibre to do that. Then that also enables OSMF to create the API.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Question?
I'm also referring to the last point here. And I'm not sure if I misunderstand, but I feel there is a self-contradiction. Because you say the access is too hard because it's open, and it has this community because it's open, and that's what you acknowledge. But you say we need a more easy access, which would, for example, mean we need a decision on the schema. We would need a decision on the format, right? But that is like that can't be from the OSM project as is. It would either be a company as it is now, or a community member, and then it would still be outside the OSM project. So
Yes.
My problem is that if, for example, for the dumps you showed, if that one of them was a GeoPacket done, that would mean a schema would need to be decided on, and that's not what can happen in OSM because of the openness.
Yes, exactly. So I agree, and then I think that project needs to be downstream of OSMF. I doubt it will be part of the OSMF project because that would be like a major leap for them to go into creating a tabular schema. So I think I agree with you in that like it would need to be a group of community members, a consortium, or a company that attempts to standardize or create a general purpose tabular schema that's downstream from OSM. I don't think that it is going to be in scope for the OSM project itself.
May I add to the,
Yes.
the response? Because the question is, what is now, if you say that, what is missing from the current solutions we have, right? From the downloads we have from Neogeography, from the downloads we have in multiple APIs, from the downloads we have of OSM in a standardized way. What is missing for you?
So can you name a specific example of a tabular, like a shapefile that?
I mean, Neogeography, you can download shapefiles.
So
you make the
it,
decision of what is an end user.
right, but is the generation of those open source?
I think it is. I'm not sure.
I mean, sort of, but it's not hard to do. You could, in theory, just do it. I work at Geography, and you can just put into OSM to PGSQL and do it yourself. There's no magic there. There's very little magic there.
So I think making that easy is the point. So like make that well documented and easy, and make it so it's accessible to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, there's always documentation improvements you can do with everything you expect to send.
For example, I'm also this time when I work for Highgate, and we have Awesome, and they get a REST API to just get any JS, and then you get any object from those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a REST API, you set your filter, and you get any object.
So one kind of interesting part about REST APIs is that if somebody wanted to like use the REST API, would they have to scrape your API, for example? Like I think what's more interesting is being able to reproduce the API completely, but usually that is quite involved, and that's one of the accessibility barriers that I'm talking about. Because if you only limit access to the data through an API, that means that if it's deprecated in 5 years, I don't know why, but this often happens. If the data access relies on, let's say, an overpass instance existing, then that's very different than having like a flat file.